Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being here at this early hour. My name is Brian Adamson. I am a professor of law at Seattle University School of Law. I am a graduate of Case Western Reserve University, a 1990 grad, and as I'm thankful to them for convening this program and having me come in and have this discussion with you for a few moments. And I'm happy to be back in Cleveland and really enjoying my time here and seeing old friends and family. It's been great. And thank you again for allowing me to share some of my work and some of my research regarding the law, the First Amendment, and particularly as the First Amendment and other laws and policies regulating speech and association impact protests, and specifically impact the protests of blacks and blacks making claims in the context of protesting for change in policies and change in situations in our communities. And also this particular talk and this particular research takes on issues directly related to the media and the media construction of stories around black protests and black claims making. And so that's really what I want to talk about today, the Fourth Estate protest scripts and how mass media legitimizes state violence against marginalized groups. Recently, there's been a round of legislation nationwide introduced by lawmakers in 19 or 20 states that attempts to criminalize and penalize protest in various ways. Protesters obstructing traffic, making laws against tampering with or trespassing on infrastructure, such as railways and pipelines, laws against picketing, laws against wearing masks, economic terrorism, anti-racketeering laws. Particularly disturbing are bills that are attempting to remove from liability from drivers who accidentally, quote unquote, accidentally hit and kill protesters. Now these laws arose maybe out of the election of President Trump, maybe the protests around Standing Rock, maybe the protests in the wake of black killings by officers across the country, and the protests that those engendered, particularly by the groups like Black Lives Matter. But what's curious to me is the degree to which the media may have been a part of pushing and in some ways reinforcing this movement toward reactions and responses to claims making. And so my talk is based upon basically two assertions. One, that the media and the production of news is a system of power. And what I mean by that is that they possess power, they wield the power, and they preserve and protect those in possession of power through their construction of stories and in the narratives that they create around, particularly around black protests. Also, my talk is also premised on this notion that media itself, and news in particular, is the site of the struggle over social reality. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the images and the identities of people, the images and identities and stories about the claims that they make and their grievances, their narratives versus the narratives about them that the media advances. And that's what I'm talking about here today. And these premises go to the fundamental part of our discussion about black protest and black claims making and the way in which mass media constructs realities around and about blacks, other marginalized groups, and the claims that they make in the context of articulating grievances and mass advocacy for change. And in this talk and in my research, I assert that to reclaim effective civil rights practices is imperative to understand a few things. One, the ways in which media constructs and articulates narratives around black protest. Two, the consequences for effective and efficient civil rights advocacies where there's an anti-black ideology, and that anti-black ideology is an intrinsic form and an intrinsic feature of the institutional arrangements between criminal courts, law enforcement, and mass media systems. And then finally, how Black media, news gathering, and news delivery reforms could contribute to the dismantling of majoritarian narratives that shape and even sanction resistance to policy reforms demanded through Black claims making, and even sanction violence toward those making the claims. Now, using text in every form, whether it be words, images, or sounds, or some combination thereof, we see the ways in which media advances ideas and advances particular contentions, right? We see also that the way in which these semantic features are a part of media impact the way in which audience perceive them. So I want to get into sort of my basic thesis here again. And that through routine news gathering and reporting processes, media recreate and reinforce adverse stereotypes and the structural racism in our institutions and reaffirm majoritarian supremacy over marginalized groups. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking broadly, giving you a preview of broadly what I want to talk about today. Media frames and protest scripts, disparate policing experiences with regards to the way in which police oversee and manage and respond to Black protest. And then finally, closing on looking at news gathering and reporting reforms. So first, it's important to perhaps lay some groundwork in terms of the construction of stories. That is to say, how news is built, right? It's built upon the idea of scripts. News scripts is a sequence of events that facilitates a comprehension or understanding of a particular text or a particular idea. It's a heuristic pattern, and it allows us as audience members a way of understanding and comprehending issues, events, behaviors, right? And narratives are just a particular type of script, right? Particularly stories about crime and protest have four components. Crime scripts are usually violent, usually episodic, that is a one-off, they're talking about a particular event in a particular time. There's usually an agent involved, the cause or the connection between the event and a person that has triggered the event. And typically in the crime story of news, there is a set of figures, a recurring set of figures, a suspect, known or unknown, right? Law enforcement, and of course a victim and or the victim's family. And that is just one aspect of news narratives, right? And crime scripts are a particular type of narrative, of course, and the most common and most economically lucrative in news genre. So daily print, for example, news providers rely heavily on the genre to generate sale. Local news broadcasts, which remain the most popular medium for news acquisition, relies on crime scripts to generate optimal ratings. Murders, armed robberies, violent accidents, kidnappings, or gang activities are common staples in news broadcasts and newscasts, and thus the axiom, if it leads, it bleeds. Stories that don't lend themselves so well to kinetic visuals or wordplay are rarely, if ever, seen. So, for example, little time on the news and print is devoted to crimes such as tax evasion, embezzlement, or fraud. Now, like I said, crime scripts most often focus on concrete events and drama, emotion, and their impact on ordinary people. And as I said, typically they have four components. One other particular type of crime script that one particular type of news narrative that incorporates crime scripts are protest paradigms and protest scripts. Right? Particularly paradigms with regards to protest and the conducting of protests and protest events. They're classic forms of expression, right? And there's a host of paradigms in which protest activities communicate. All right? Protests can emphasize the literal, the symbolic, the aesthetic, the sensory through chanting, dance, and theater. Protests can engage movement in space like parades and pickets and marches. They could be centered on solemnity and the sacred, as with vigils and prayers. They could be acts of civil disobedience, such as the sit-ins and blockades. Also, institutional and conventional activities, such as lobbying and boycotts and picketing and lawsuits. Or they could involve collective violence and threats through physical harm or property destruction. But whether and how a given protest is deemed newsworthy is dependent on several different categories or several different factors. Once again, protest scripts hew closely to crime scripts, and to the extent that the protest features elements that are attractive as a matter of crime, conflict, violence, the presence of law enforcement, it is more likely to be written about and is more likely to be described in ways in which we describe crime scripts. In addition, narratives regarding protests have certain consistent features to them as well. Maybe talking about the protest's appearance, the way and the act of movement, the theater that is involved or engaged in the protest, the invocation of public opinion. Oftentimes, the reporter will seek to get bystander opinions about the efficacy of the efforts, about the inconvenience that they are enduring as a result of the picketing. Those are often features as well. Story frames, which I'll talk about in a few more minutes, I'll get to in greater detail, talk about how the descriptive biases that go into the telling of the protest and how that impacts the interpretation and perception of events. The reliance on official news sources like crime scripts is also a very important feature of protest scripts. And in certain cases, and in the most, I would say, adverse cases, as we will see, particularly with regards to Ferguson and some of the protests in Cleveland with regards to Tamir Rice's killing, we see the delegitimization, delegitimizing, and the demonization of the protest, the causes, or the individuals involved in the protest. In moving to talking about protests and the writing of protests, writing about protests, it's important to think about things with regards to frames. One of the frames to think about is the working routines. The other is media narratives, and finally, individuals as framing. Now, first with regards to working routines, before I get to rhetorical devices, news doesn't rationally occur, right? It doesn't just pop up. A reporter has to be present and using her senses, have semantic reactions to events around them, right? But the reaction of what she or he has perceived is not exactly everything that is happening with regards to an event. So the perception and the reporting and the observation itself is infused with selection bias in terms of what is chosen to write about, right? And there are also ideological assumptions that undergird those selections in terms of what's written about. Media frames are central organizing ideas or storylines that give meaning to an unfolding group of events or a strip of events. And it gives meanings to the scripts in terms of media frames. The media frames can be in the form of words, video, sound, or some combination thereof. But there are also rhetorical devices that occur in media scripts, particularly with regards to the use of language and words such as metaphors, catchphrases, exemplars. We have also visual imagery and depictions of the event. And also the narratives in terms of how they're structured have three primary types of reasoning frames. Protest narratives in the news will often talk about the roots, not often, but often enough, but often talk about the root causes of the event, of the protest. We'll also talk about the consequences of certain events related to the protest. There may also be appeals to morals, appeals to peace, appeals to calm that we also hear. And often we will see the use of words and framing words with regards to protests, and not just protests, but news stories in general, in terms of signaling through headlines, through lead sentences, through the placement of stories, and particularly very common framing conventions in journalism that are multitude. There are a multitude of those, right? One of the most critical, however, aspects of regarding construction and articulation of crime and protest narratives involves one major component of them, and that is that most narratives regarding protests are typically surrounded or developed through official sources. Now, here rests the most critical aspect of the construction or articulation of crime narratives, and whether in crime scripts or in protest scripts, is this reliance upon official sources. There is this interdependence and the symbiosis that exists between the media and law enforcement institutions. And the influence of criminal and law enforcement agents willed on the media's crime coverage and black protests is very real. So through police reports, through rap sheets, through arrest photographs, criminal and court records, and press conferences, key criminal and law enforcement institutions are the principal sources and principal suppliers of crime stories. And because blacks and other minorities are disproportionately represented in encounters with law enforcement and with the legal system and with criminal justice system, the documents, the rap sheets, the arrest and court records, the mug shots are going to be more easily and more readily accessible to the media for the framing and the construction of their stories around crime and their stories around protest. And so in this way, this is what I mean, that the influence of criminal law and law enforcement agents and the influence that they wield on the media's crime coverage is just not narrowly behavioral. It's ideological and it's attitudinal as well. Right? Let's take one example. This was a story that ran on NBC News and ran in the Cincinnati Enquirer for a moment. It was surrounded a few years ago when Ray Tenzing shot and killed Sam DUBOSE as Sam DUBOSE was trying to drive away in the car. Many of us remember this episode. However, many of us maybe did not remember and did not see the way in which that story was featured. What is wrong with that picture? Right? We see that the media, that the news writer, whoever wrote the story, whoever developed the story, used stock photographs from on the right. Perhaps Sam DUBOSE had been arrested in some other context or some other event, and what looks to be the graduation photo of Ray Tenzing, right? And we see how the media, once again, this interplay and interaction between the media and crime and law enforcement agencies have in framing and shaping stories. And that image alone communicates, and what that image alone communicates about the culpability of the respective parties in that particular event. So I talked a little bit about working routines and media narratives, and then individuals as audience, however. That we as individuals take in and interpret those texts that are advanced by the media. One other aspect of media framing and the interplay between law enforcement agents and the media that I didn't mention and I do want to talk about is the staging of press conferences. Press conferences often come in conjunction with major events, particularly regarding crime. And most recently, we see them most often related to instances of officer-involved killings and press conferences that seek to explain those things. Those are one unique and strategic type of narratives that are advanced by police officers. What's unique about press conferences is that they are able to, or I should say, police officers are able to strategically leverage the media to construct their narratives. Right? There's a one-to-many, there's the monologic where the police officer's office standing behind a flag. So press conferences are a combination of stagecraft, public relations, and information giving, which allows police chiefs and prosecutors a virtually unfettered opportunity to frame controversies, justify actions, or explain outcomes. I want to talk a little bit about Tamir Rice in terms of another example before we get to talking about more detailed and more protests. And another way in which the interplay between the media and law enforcement agents work to construct narratives around black crime and black criminality. So one day after the shooting, a news website, Cleveland.com, posted an article by one of their reporters, right? In his first story, the reporter wrote about Tamir's mother and her criminal history. Many of you may remember that story. Then days later, the reporter, along with another reporter, wrote a piece on Twitter on Tamir's father's criminal history. Now, the story on Tamir Rice ostensibly was about the attorney the family hired to represent them in the tragedy. The headline was this, quote, "Lawyers representing Tamir Rice's family defended boy's mom in drug trafficking case," end quote. Now, 6 of the 9 paragraphs in that story, however, have nothing to do with this attorney, but everything to do about Tamir's criminal record and the 2 sentences about its possible impact on her son. Right? The story about Tamir's father, Leonard Warner, is astounding in its bias because it makes no attempts whatsoever to connect the father's history to why a police officer killed a 12-year-old boy. This is yet again another example of the media using criminal records and law enforcement to frame stories and to impact and influence the way in which we perceive and interpret events around those stories. The Ferguson protests were also very unique, as we all know, that these are various images of those protests that were held in the wake of the Michael Brown killing. And these were, by extension, images that could have been used or could have been used in terms of stories to be written about the events. But we also saw with Ferguson this hypermilitarization of the response to protest and demonstration that we're seeing more and more in jurisdictions that now have access to and readily use military equipment that's been purchased or been given to local jurisdictions, right? And instead of the images of peaceful protests, instead of the images of vigils, instead of the images of chanting and marching and parading in peace, all of which occurred during the Ferguson killings, and the ensuing demonstrations. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch elected to use this image on the front of its newspaper. And what's interesting here is I attempted to tag or code a few of the particular features of this particular front page. Note the kicker. Well, first note the color of the text and the font size, the day of protest, night of frenzy, and what red signifies. You have the kicker, hundreds gathered to mourn unarmed teen who was killed by police. And then you have another kicker that leads to this scene of this is all Ferguson was about, right? You have what we call an anchor, where a story, or let's say a sentence below a picture attempts to describe what's happening in the picture, and can also be infused with bias. So it talks about the tear gas flames and the police trucks, right? Once again, you have the photo choice, he being described, Michael Brown being described as a quote unquote gentle giant. And then interestingly, you have this picture of this unidentified African-American male going inside of a store, obviously, or say, looting, right? And so those were the images that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch chose to run with in their description and depiction of the injustices around policing in Ferguson. This is not the first time. I want to go back a little bit back in history to talk about some examples of Black dissent in history and the proceedings of the rebellious Negroes emphasizes this particular point and issue. Mass media depictions of Blacks as thugs, criminals, or people otherwise bent on social disruption has a 400-year history in America. And by 1619, even before the birth of the United States, the possession and commodification of Black bodies had begun in the Americas, and newspapers played more than just a passing role in slavery's commercialization. In depicting and describing slaves and their activities, newspapers were instrumental in constructing the Black image in the popular imagination. News publications during the colonial era took the form of multi-page newspapers, pamphlets, what they call broadsides, leaflets, right? And between 1619 and 1775, there were approximately 80 weekly, bi-weekly, or tri-weekly newspapers circulating in and between the colonies. In them, news of enslaved Blacks was explicit, right, and almost always negative. Now, certainly colonial newspapers supported racist institutional structures merely through the presentment of advertisements for the purchase and sale of slaves. That much is true and clear. However, news stories describing a fugitive slave, an actual or aborted slave uprising, or other alleged criminal behavior was proto-racist, if for no other reason than the fact that those stories were virtually the only stories in newspapers ever told about Blacks back then. And so the proceeding of the rebellious Negroes was a weekly report of slave activities generated from nearly every place in the New World, even in the Caribbean colonies. And the proceedings of the rebellious Negroes ran in colonial newspapers. Now, as formal mass media gathering or news gathering channels were not existent or not in abundance at the very least, news was often based on hearsay and gossip. Right? News items, however, would appear in letter extracts, in editor reports, in execution sermons, or last word confessions from the scaffold. Between 1690 and 1775, in fact, the press reported 47 slave revolts, planned or realized, and hundreds of crimes allegedly committed by Blacks. Now, slave rebellions were just one of the most important types of news, not just because of the economic calamity that could come through the loss of an invaluable labor source. Press accounts also instilled in colonists the fear of slave uprisings and addressed how violent self-manumissions would threaten social and racial order. And furthermore, as if to soothe the fears of whites, where known, news reports would trumpet the dire consequences that befell the unsuccessful rebellions. In 1712, for example, the Boston Newsletter told of 70 Negroes in custody following, quote, a late conspiracy to murder the Christians, end quote, within the New York colony. And for that offense, slaves who had taken an active role in the insurrection were, quote, burned, broke on the wheel, and hanged up alive to be left to die, end quote. Now, the intent perhaps was to reassure whites that Blacks had been brought to justice and that justice meted out was particularly vicious. And perhaps due to the dire social risk to whites that any slave rebellion symbolized or could mean, published accounts in one newspaper outlet were often picked up by other purveyors. So, for example, the Boston Evening Post printed a letter of a thwarted uprising in 1745, which was subsequently reprinted in New York newspapers and ran for 12 days in Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Gazette. As another example, between April and October 1741, Boston's 5 weekly newspapers reported on the 1741 New York conspiracy, as a result of which New York had executed 17 slaves and ordered 42 out of the colony. Now, aside from the textual similarities between the accounts of slave insurrections and Ferguson unrest, for example, unavoidable connections are seen in how blacks were and are policed. The fear instilled by news narratives constructing blacks predisposed to commit unfathomable criminal acts and bent on rebellion led to another form of social control off the plantations. Loitering laws, part of sweeping slave codes, represented an instance in which news reports helped shape social policy and legal policy. Even before emancipation shifted racial ideologies and practices, concerns over blacks' ambulation and congregation off plantations was widespread. I mean, newspapers sounded the alarm for whites. For example, between 1719 and 1784, the Boston Gazette made over 330 references to slaves and slavery. And some of those references made reference to lack of proper supervision and general consternation over the public behavior and claims of the bad effects, quote unquote, of Negroes to freely constitute together. Now, as a result of the slave codes were created and that included restricting the movement and congregation of more than three or five blacks in one particular place. We see those laws in place still nonetheless, although they are deracialized. We did, however, see those laws enforced in the Keep Moving policy that the police instituted during the Ferguson demonstrations, where people were restricted from standing still on the sidewalk. They had to keep moving or keep walking or they would be subject to arrest. And the ACLU successfully successfully challenged that law and got it off the books, but not after several people had been arrested. Another instance of the legal and social control of blacks in movement and protest has to do with the long hot summer of '67, where in that summer, in the wake of the Newark and Detroit riots, the Justice Department convened a conference for news executives that included the FCC representatives, and they did this in Poughkeepsie. And the Justice Department wanted to find out how they could have an influence on guidelines that the media would use in covering racial disturbances. They talked about the need to have certain guidelines in terms of how news reporting was happening with regards to the racial disturbances that were going on at that time in major cities related to economic inequities as well as the war in Vietnam. Right? That Justice Department executive wanted to see ways in which the television news reporters could help cool down or ameliorate the tensions in the ghettos by better news treatment. Now, NBC News President Reuben Frank at the time wrote to Roger Wilkins of the Justice Department in response to his request. He had helped organize the conference, and he protested that, quote, the discussion was asking a medium of journalism to act as an instrument of social control. We must never accept such a request. It is not for us to cooperate with the government in establishing guidelines. But within a year after Martin Luther King's assassination and the Chicago riots, all three networks pretty much did just that and adopted their own guidelines for covering the riots, more or less matching the government's recommendations and suggestions. For example, CBS told its staff in a letter that the best coverage is not necessarily one with the best pictures or most dramatic action, discouraging them away from covering the protests. But at the same time, movement leaders were to be censored as well. In late 1968, early 1969, and NBC producers, for example, agreed that stories which showed black militant leaders taking violent acts or threatening violence were not to be broadcast and were not acceptable. And two Black Panther Party leaders, H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, were banned from appearing on NBC. So by accenting the difference between legitimate and illegitimate movements and by elevating the former and disparaging and or withdrawing support or attention rather from the latter, the media worked in some ways to restabilize American politics around a new moderate anti-war consensus, while remaining responsive to the administration's definition of the situation in both Vietnam and at home. And then we have what happened in Ferguson. In my content narrative analysis of news coverage of Ferguson, Missouri demonstrations, news audiences were saturated on a daily basis with words, images, and sounds, and the police and military grade gear, M16s, armored tanks, as we saw, tear gas, attack dogs, and flashbang canisters wielded against predominantly black bodies. Of nearly 1,800 news stories from 11 major television, print, and radio outlets, protesters were referred to as thugs in over 20% of those stories. And words such as violence, war, chaos were used about 2,800 times. I know it may be hard to see some of those. Almost impossible to see from back there, but I'll share that with you later. So that's what we get when we see narratives that are through selective bias and descriptive biases cause us to interpret and have perceptions about particular movements and events in a way that is racially biased. And some of the contents or the comments that went along with some of the images and some of the stories that we read about Ferguson are right here. Those images and those selective descriptions and the biases that were infused in the descriptions of the Ferguson protests are in marked contrast to the way in which we see news covering white disruption and white claims making. So I want to just talk briefly about 3 examples. So in Lexington, Kentucky, about 5 years ago, there was a basketball game. And I think whoever lost, I think Louisville lost that game. And so there are riots. Right? They are people just in the streets, just turning over cars, fires burning, the whole 9, right? Not a thug among them, right? They're described as drunken revelers, kids who got out of hand, right? In Keene, New Hampshire, there was a pumpkin festival, and folks decided to riot after that because the festival ended. Property damage, arrests were made, police were injured. Again, rarely a thug amongst them in reviewing the reports around those incidents. In Twin Peaks in Waco, Texas, right, dozens of people shot through a shootout between rival gang members. One police officer said it was the bloodiest scene he had ever witnessed in terms of who died and the carnage. Rarely a thug there during the Waco shootout. And in fact, we see these pictures associated with the aftermath of bringing everything together. This is their response to one of the bloodiest shootouts in that city. So we once again have to ask ourselves about militarization and hypermilitarization and how the images around police responses to unrest, to disruption, to protests feed into the narratives that are constructed around black protests. Why does it matter? It matters in an academic sense from these 2 theories, theory of cultivation and the theories of priming. Now, cultivation theory holds that in the aggregate, stories and images cutting across all program types, news, fiction, nonfiction, entertainment, sports, they evince a pattern in the portrayal of specific people, topics, or issues. It's been studied and found that for heavy television viewers, like long-term exposure to a relatively stable set of messages cultivates their perceptions on given subjects. And it has that effect in two ways. One, it gives them distorted views of their own social reality. And two, it impacts an audience's global reactions to real-world events such as perceptions, attitudes, feelings, and values. For example, avid soap opera, studies have been done on avid soap opera viewers, and they typically overestimate the actual divorce rate in America, right? That's first order cultivation of effects. The second order cultivation effects are called what happens in like the mean world syndrome, that people over time in viewing consistent, persistent issue or say stories around violence or crime tend to feel that the whole world is mean and that there is nothing they can do about it and control it, and that the world is filled with crime, even despite truth facts that show that crime in their particular neighborhood is actually down. They will still nonetheless believe that there is a mean world around them. And so those things speak to the power of media to make impressions about people's perceptions and their values. Priming refers to the short-term impact of exposure to a mass-mediated stimulus or on subsequent judgments or behaviors. Stereotypes and mental schemas are important parts of priming effects. And it's been shown that people make race-related judgments based on their news viewing habits. And clearly, viewing even limited stereotypical representations of blacks in the media influences attitudes, beliefs, and behavior of audience members. For example, one study found that news viewers exposed to unidentified criminality will rate racially unidentified perpetrators as having a high likelihood of being black. In addition, the study found that amongst heavy television viewers, unidentified officers will be perceived as being both white and being both positive figures. The exposure to black rather than white suspects in news also led to increased support for the death penalty and 3 strikes legislation even. And this is what we also know about racial disparities in the presentation of whites and blacks. We know that blacks are underrepresented on television news and national news, that blacks are underrepresented as police officers, underrepresented as crime victims, and whites are overrepresented as crime victims based on statistics available in terms of the actual crimes that take place. Blacks in criminal roles outnumber, quote unquote roles, outnumber blacks in socially positive representation in newscasts and daily newspapers. In one particular study of 596 news stories spanning 26 television stations and 48 newscasts over 12 years in 11 large cities, black-focused stories were 2.5 times more likely than white-focused stories to be about crime. Some other statistics. Symbolic threats. Blacks are typically presented as more symbolically threatening and more culpable than whites accused of similar crimes. So you may see more often than not the black as opposed to the white doing a perp walk, the black with a mugshot, the black in handcuffs or somehow restrained. Those images occur more often than not than white images. And so leading to or allowing someone to bring or to infuse this, make this inference of culpability is this inference of guilt. Interesting studies have been done around news conversations and how news conversations matter with regards to racial presentation and representation. Right? And here are just some statistics there, and I wanted to share with you. There are also disparities with regards to news readers. with regards to who talks about and who reports on crime in local news broadcasts, finding that whites delivered 75% of the crime stories versus 16% of blacks relating such news. And in markets that had two anchors, that shared anchors, simultaneous anchors on crime news, white anchors led the conversation 79% of the time, while blacks led 11% of the news items. So we compound these facts about the media presentation and representation of crime and crime events on in television in television and print, and we compound those with the words and sounds and images of hypermilitarized police against African Americans and the preferred and privileged, which are preferred and privileged by the media, those sounds, the violence, the conflict, the law enforcement response, and the selective and descriptive biases that are infused there. And we see how overall these media stories, these media narratives advance a type of orthodoxy that seeks to continue to place marginalized groups at the margins. But what about movements? And I'll be concluding in a few minutes. Movements themselves, like Black Lives Matter, they come into the spotlight for reasons that, of course, that are rational, right? That is to increase supporters, to garner sympathy for their movement, to cause attention, right? To challenge institutions, to attack or neutralize opposition, to sustain and control its narrative, right? Movements use mass media and news, and they're not passive objects, right? They're not passive objects of the media attention, and therein lies the struggle, right? The struggle between these groups and organizations to control the narrative about the organization and its causes. And that struggle, once again, is cited on media and media platforms, right? And is contested even in the media, where the media presents its own narratives about those events that sometimes debase, demean, sublimate the real issues and real causes that the movement is trying to surface. There are some solutions to these particular, let me jump ahead here, to these particular issues regarding the way in which Black protest is reported and talked about in news media. I don't think that they entirely lie in First Amendment regulations and reforms, although some of them do. But I also, though, believe that they do lie in the creation and the development of counter-narratives. So we see the new platforms, new media platforms that are led and controlled by groups such as Black Lives Matter and other Black groups or Black interested parties and organizations, going into the space to create and control the narratives that are told about them. Now, granted, these platforms will never be, or I won't say never, are not the size and scope and influence and the breadth and the reach of the NBCs or the ABCs or the CBSs, but they mark a modest example of the ways in which narratives are sought to be controlled about one's own place and one's own issues and identity and the images that are associated with those. Consumer and agency issues are very important too in reforming how we take in and how we can be more critical about what we read and what we view and how we interpret what we're viewing with a more critical eye. So those are also part of reform solutions. So I talked a little bit about this and how media constructs social reality and how it reinforces institutions such as law enforcement institutions, courts, and it legitimizes, even in some cases, institutional responses to dissent. I also talked a little bit about how claims making can be perceived as an institutional threat. I offer the fact that, and the possibility that the way in which the response we see to Black protest and Black claims making is in proportion to the consequences of answering those claims to the institutions that they're attacking. That is to say, what they're claiming is serious, what they're claiming is legitimate, what they're claiming could mean the questioning and the upending of the very institutions that the media and other institutions rely upon for their self-sustaining. So that's basically it. We hope, once again, to say that the media is a site to build consensus around, if not agreement over, social problems and the solutions to those problems. The media constructs narratives around protests and claims by and about outside marginalized groups in a way that often subverts and derails meaningful discussion through issue avoidance, through diffusion, through oversimplification, even debasement, and encouraging social control and normalcy from disruption. Now, racially based representations, their cognitive impacts of the sounds, the words, the images constructed in telling the narratives of Black descent and quashing and quelling the same toward a rhetoric of normalcy and return to stasis, hardens opposition. And those crime scripts, along with the selective and descriptive biases which which are a part of the reporting paradigm, exert appreciable influence on audiences' perceptions of issues and ultimately the opinions that they express. Right? The semantic texts not put forward by news media in these stories illustrate the way in which, in the stories about white deviance, illustrate also the way in which white deviance is made invisible. It's made invisible by not naming it, and that thus affords perpetrators the privilege of stereotype avoidance. So those ravaging Keene and Lexington and those who left Twin Peaks bloody and bullet-ridden received neither the scrutiny nor the acrimony visited upon the Ferguson protesters, for example. No story would be written found to discuss, say, the cultural dysfunction of white men and their tendency to overconsume alcohol. Right? No story would be crying for whites' personal responsibility to end the cycle of white violence and criminality. Right? Nor were there calls for voices that could speak for the white community, right? To perhaps illuminate the pathology that explains, for example, what motivates whites to riot over pumpkins. The consequences and the stakes are what make it different, right? Like I said, Black claims threaten. The response is in proportion to that threat. And mass media has an interest in maintaining its role as arbiter of social reality. But to quote the great Gil Scott-Heron, the revolution will not be televised. Thank you. Minutes.
Excuse me. First, thank you for a very interesting presentation on a topic that I think has gotten either little or no coverage. So, I think that's part of the point you're making. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, how would you, in a fairly simple way, address people like the president and people like that who would say, "Oh, you got it all wrong. The media is against white people. The media is against the police. The media is against conservatives," despite some of the stories you've told. But I'd like sort of a simple explanation that, in case it comes up in conversation.
Okay, well, that's just simply not factual. Just like many things that the man says. It's fake news. That's fake. No, not to be flippant about it, because that is a real perception. But no, I mean, anyone who's done, I mean, you don't even have to do a study of media to look at the way in which what's reported and what's talked about and the biases that are inherent in it. I mean, if you need to go to statistics, there are some sources out there that will tell you in terms of in terms of those disparities. So some of the research that I have, I'm happy to share with you that you can sort of summarize and use it in your conversations. But no, that is once again is who controls the media and who owns those channels of communication, the ways in which they're framing them. At the end of the day, do no harm to the majoritarian interest, do no harm to Trump, do no harm to those who complain that the media focuses on issues of race, issues of injustice too much. Because in fact, that is part of, the extent it doesn't, that should be part of the media's job. Oh, I don't know.
Lots of questions.
He's got the mic there. No, I'm sorry.
So thank you again for your lecture. It was really interesting. I had one question for you about access to counter-narratives. So in a world where most people are getting a lot of their news on social media and where social media is specifically designed to basically put people in an ideological vacuum, you know, you click on one story with a certain representation, it gives you the other stories with that representation. How do we socially help to improve accessibility of counter narratives like you were discussing?
Yeah, we've all put ourselves in these ideological silos with regards to the news, our news feeds and what we tend to, because we take in a lot of information and we can be overstimulated. So we try to control what we can in our environments, and our media environments is one way we do it. Literacy with regards to looking at stories, looking at different sources, trying to be intentional about looking at different sources is, I think, one of the most important things. And I try to do that. I'm not always really good at it, but I've got 6 sources that I'll look to on particular issues, and that run the ideological spectrum. I think we need to do that, and then we need to share those stories within our news feeds, within our social networks, and share whether they agree with our points of view or disagree with our points of view. That's hard. That's easier said than done. But I think those are the main answers. It's tough.
Is there any formal process of conveying the statistics, the analyses that you've presented to the major media outlets? Because when you talk about counter narratives, that, as you were just saying, it's so difficult.
Right.
And I don't see major changes happening unless the major TV newscasts or newspapers don't have such a bias.
They have to be. It is something that they have to be conscientious of and conscious of. There's been some movements, for example, a movement to get broadcasters to start looking at the data. Look at your news stories. How many news stories you do in a month? What about the crime news, and who's featured and how are those featured? Doing that and makes them more intentional about thinking about how they report and what they report about. It's just one way of doing it. Hiring, of course, changes, and the hiring is not only just dropping, but overall in terms of media outlets, but minorities or accurate representations of communities within the media organizations is woefully disproportionate. And I think that's one of the solutions to the problem of getting that information, getting that data, getting that those statistics, getting that consciousness in the newsroom. So when they're sitting around a table and they want to, somebody was stuck on, let's put that picture of DUBOSE and Tinsley up there. Somebody's there. Doesn't necessarily have to be a person of color, but the likelihood that that person would be a person of color and could bring that to the fore would be more likely. So yeah. Hiring is another one.
Hello, Brian.
Hello, John.
So my question actually follows up on that one. I'm interested to know what's going on in journalism schools. Has the data been filtered down to the students, the up-and-coming reporters, so that perhaps some of this can be nipped in the bud? Because and stem the tide.
Some of the better journalism schools, I'd say, like, I know Syracuse has curriculum on, has a class on race and reporting and civil rights, and there's another course at Syracuse that specifically talks about, or specifically covers apparently, the civil rights movement and journalism that covered the civil rights movement. I don't know how this is getting into the journalism schools, though, in any type of really intelligent way, just anecdotally, John. But also, the AP just recently, it was interesting news, changed their guidelines with regards to racism and how their reporters are supposed to talk about race and racism in this current era where there's all of these racist things happening. Reporters and stories are reluctant to call it that. they say racially charged or other euphemisms for racism. And so AP, which publishes the Style Guide, which is basically the Bible that journalists use in terms of writing conventions, has just issued a revision, basically saying that, you know, if you're talking about racial events and racism, and it's okay to call it that. And so that's another way in which at least it's filtering into the routines and how reporting is supposed to be done. I don't know. Yeah. There's some person over there. No.
Good morning. I'm a ninth grade teacher from Harding High School in Warren, and Brian is my classmate.
Hey there.
But I just did a social racial justice piece throughout the whole year that I had to fight to teach. I did The Hate You Give, and I had to actually fight to teach that book in my classroom. What I'm wondering is if I can get a copy of your presentation here.
Oh, of course. Of course. You could have several copies. You know where to find me. No, that's wonderful.
I'm really just wondering, do you have access, do you present to journalism organizations at journalism schools? I mean, are you targeting that versus?
Versus this? Yes, yes, yes. I am. I've only been successful in talking to one journalism school. That's at my class. My class is at my home school in Seattle. But I'm currently just starting to sort of put this out there. Okay. But if you have suggestions.
I do. I do. I'll speak with you afterward.
All right. Thank you. That's it. Thank you for your time and understanding and patience. I really appreciate it. Thanks. Okay. Look at there. My goodness gracious.